The chains that the Dean had invoked wrapped around Cyan's body, rendering him immobile. The chains began to emit a powerful energy that started advancing in all directions. The Dean approached him and revealed that it didn't matter what he did because he wouldn't be able to escape from his chain tower, a 9-star spell. Upon hearing this, Cyan simply lowered his head and remained silent. The Dean turned his head to one side, began stroking his beard with his hand, and with an interesting look, came to the conclusion that he must have overestimated his abilities. While Cyan was looking down at the ground, his body started emitting a dark energy. Upon hearing what the Dean thought of him, he began to smile and decided to prove himself right. Upon seeing the energy emanating from Cyan's body, Dean's expression drastically changed. He stopped touching his beard and, with a surprised look, became alert and started wondering what was happening. With a sinister gaze, Cyan began to lift his head and activated the Void Sphere applied technique, causing dark energy to slowly surround his entire body. Little by little, the dark energy of Cyan's spell began to absorb the chains that Dean had summoned. He reached his hand to his head and couldn't help but be shocked. He started looking at Cyan with a confused look. For him, the Void Sphere was an absurd spell since it was only 1-star rated. But despite this, it was absorbing his own spell. In a matter of seconds, the energy sphere that Cyan had summoned began to grow enormous and slowly started absorbing the golden chains. The sphere became so big that the chains around Cyan's body loosened and came undone. Cyan's spell began to emit a powerful energy, creating a blizzard that started moving in all directions. Dean approached, bringing his arm to his head, clenched his fist tightly, lifted his head and started looking towards the ceiling. Upon seeing how powerful the 1-star spell was, he couldn't help but be shocked and start sweating. He stared intently at Cyan and questioned just how talented he was. Several seconds later, Cyan sat on the ground, resting one knee on it and placing his arm on the other knee. At that moment, the sphere surrounding his body began to disappear, breaking the golden chains into pieces. The Dean couldn't help but wonder what was happening and why Cyan was so strong. Several seconds later, he stood up, put his hand in his pants pocket, used the other hand to clean his shirt, closed his eyes, and asked the Dean if he thought he was useful now. In response, the Dean simply remained silent for several seconds. While sweat was dripping from his face, the Dean began to stare at Cyan and responded to his question with a yes, and also decided to withdraw the warning. After saying this, he asked him if this was really all he wanted. Cyan started looking at him and with a smile replied with a yes, adding that he just wanted to have a peaceful student life. The Dean wasn't very sure if Cyan was telling the truth, so he started looking down and asked again if this was really everything. In response, Cyan approached him and calmly replied that this was it. He began to stare at the Dean. Deep down, what he didn't want was to see the academy collapse again. At the same time, it began to dusk and the sun slowly started to set, and the lights of all the houses turned on. Somewhere in the city, there was a man who was carrying a bag with food and sweets for children. While he was walking, he began to question himself if he had ended up buying all kinds of candies because he had a child at home. This man was none other than Brian. He grabbed the bag of candy with one hand, and with the other he took the bag of vegetables. He closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile, he began to imagine the dragon girl eating all the candy he had bought. Thinking about this, he couldn't help but feel happy. At that moment, he opened his eyes and with a serious look, he realized that something was not right. On the street he was walking on, it was a street that usually used to be very busy, but now it was empty and there wasn't a single soul. He abruptly stopped and with a confused look, he began to wonder why the streets were strangely quiet. He also started questioning if he was overreacting for no reason. Very close to him there was a dark alley. He turned his head to one side, and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but sweat and feel some fear. He filled himself with courage, and with a serious voice, he asked the person who was hiding to come out. At that moment, a dark energy began to emerge from the alley. Several seconds later, a person wearing academy shoes came out of the alley and started walking towards Brian. While he was holding the bag of candies in his hand, he turned his head to the side and upon seeing who it was, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but sweat. He began staring at the person who had come out of the alley and asked them who they were. At that moment, Brian threw the bag of candies on the floor, and several seconds later, he threw the bag containing the vegetables and disappeared without leaving a trace. Cyan returned to class, rested both arms on the table, and then rested his head on his arms. He turned his head to one side and started looking outside through the window. After the conversation with the dean, he agreed to attend his classes. Cyan had been in class for several hours, drooling and feeling very tired and sleepy. Even though this was the last class of the day, He was extremely bored. Several hours later, the last class of the day ended. Cyan left the classroom, and while closing the door, he thought that learning something one had already done 30 years ago was basically torture. He didn't have any mission to do, so he simply decided to go train. At that moment, Princess Erin appeared behind him, started staring at him and asked where he was going. Upon hearing Erin's voice, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He began looking towards the door and wondered why she had suddenly appeared. Deep down, he didn't want to have to deal with her. Several seconds passed, and upon seeing that he didn't want to answer her question, she approached him and with a serious look explained to him that the lessons hadn't finished yet. Upon hearing this, he turned his head to the side, started looking at her and couldn't help but panic. While he was starting to sweat, he quickly turned his head towards her and with a calm look addressed her as Highness and replied that he was just going to the bathroom. Erin knew that he was lying. She started to stare at him and asked him to stop lying. She crossed her arms, began to look into his eyes, and explained that this was not the way to get to the bathroom. After saying this, she asked him again if he was sure he was going to the bathroom. Leximus appeared behind her. She began to reach out her hands towards her, and upon seeing her attitude, she couldn't help but be left speechless. She became nervous and explained to Erin that she needed to behave better as a princess. Cyan put his hands in his pants pockets, turned his head towards her and with a serious look asked her if she had allowed Leximus to call her by her name. Upon hearing this, Leximus brought her hands to her chest, started looking at Cyan and couldn't help but be somewhat shocked. Erin, who had her arms crossed, began to stare at him and asked why he was changing the subject. After saying this, she explained to him that she had allowed Leximus to do that in private. She started approaching Cyan and asked why he kept calling her Highness and also if they weren't friends. He quickly turned his head to the other side, averted his gaze, called her Highness again, and explained that he was just a civilian and she was the princess. As a civilian, he couldn't simply call her by her name. Upon hearing this, she approached him, placed her hands on her waist, and thought that he was a very serious person. She decided to take it as a compliment. While they were talking, someone started descending the stairs. This person was a student who had red hair. Several seconds later, he approached where they were and with a serious voice, called Erin's attention. Upon hearing his voice, she turned her head to the side and upon seeing who this student was, her expression changed drastically. She started looking at him with a surprised look and couldn't help but be speechless and wonder why he was here. While the student was slowly descending the stairs, Erin began to tremble and couldn't help but start sweating. Cyan turned his head towards the stairs and with a serious look, started wondering who he was. Next to them were some wooden stairs. Two much older students began to descend towards them. The red-haired student put his hands in the pockets of his pants and told Erin that it had been a long time since they last saw each other. The white-haired student put one hand in his pocket, clenched the fist of the other tightly, and simply remained silent. Erin immediately recognized them. The white-haired student was Pavian, and the red-haired student was Nerovian. With a serious look, Pavian began to stare at Erin while Nerovian started to smile. She grabbed the edge of her skirt with both hands, lowered her head in front of them, began to look at the ground and replied that indeed some time had passed. Pavian approached Erin, started staring at her intently and with a serious look asked why she was spending time with peasants. Upon seeing the two of them, Leximus became nervous. She placed her hands on her abdomen and also slightly lowered her head in front of them. Nerovian approached her, crossed his arms, slightly bent his body towards her, and upon realizing that she was a friend of Leximus, he asked her if she was going around with servers now that she was all grown up. After saying this, he asked her if birds of the same feather flew together. Erin simply lowered her head in front of them and remained silent. Cyan began to stare at them intently and realized that they were from the Nepalis family, and he also knew that they were very clear about not liking her. Several seconds later, the two turned their heads to one side and upon seeing Cyan, they became somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. Pavian started looking at Cyan and asked who he was, while on the other hand, Nerovian didn't take long to recognize him as Cyan Vert. Cyan turned his body towards them and with a calm look, he told them that he was delighted to meet them. After saying this, he introduced himself as Cyan Vert, the youngest of the Verts. While Erin had her head lowered in front of them, the two began to walk towards Cyan. Pavian extended his hand towards him and explained that there was no way he didn't know a son of Duke Vert. Nerovian began to walk towards Cyan and couldn't help but praise him since the duel he had against Seth had been impressive. He decided to make sure to invite him if there was a party. He approached him, extended his hand towards him and with a smile decided to speak more. They wanted to be friends with him. Cyan simply ignored them and started looking at Erin, who still had her head down. He couldn't help but wonder what was happening and why she was behaving this way. Leximus slightly turned her head back, began to look at them with a confused look and couldn't help but wonder why they were behaving this way. Nerovian put a hand on his waist, placed the other hand on Cyan's shoulder, and with a smile explained that this was a rare opportunity. He began to look at them and with an indifferent gaze, he thanked them. With a serious look, Pavian said goodbye to him, telling him that they would see each other again. Aaron simply started looking down at the ground and remained silent. At that moment, Nerovian approached her, put his hands on her shoulders, and with a smile told her that they were not going to invite her to the parties. Upon hearing his voice, she lifted her head and couldn't help but be shocked. He asked her to know her place and also not to become too arrogant. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but tightly clench her fist and start trembling. Nerovian walked away from her and advised her to be more self-aware. After saying this, he couldn't help but start smiling. Pavian simply turned his head towards her, began staring at her with a disdainful look, and didn't even speak to her. Several seconds later, both of them began to leave. Cyan turned his head towards them, and while he was watching how they were slowly moving away, he simply remained silent. Leximus turned her body towards them and she asked Cyan if they were the princes. Aaron simply turned her back to them, started looking at the ground, and remained silent. Leximus began to look at them with a confused look and asked Aaron what was wrong with them and why they were behaving this way. Aaron, who was behind her, explained that they were still her family. As the saying goes, blood is thicker than water. Cyan turned his body towards her and with a calm look, he explained to them that he wasn't very sure about that. From his perspective, she seemed worse off than the strangers. She turned her body towards Cyan and started looking at him with a shocked expression. He turned his back on her and he began to distance himself from them, revealing that whether it was blood or water, everything was insignificant in the face of power. Therefore, if they were treating her this way, it simply meant they didn't trust her. Upon hearing this, she turned her head towards Cyan and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised and shocked at the same time. He asked her not to feel so bad, as they were only trying to keep her under control. After saying this, he said goodbye to them and left. Cyan's words made Aaron blush like a tomato. She started looking at him with a loving gaze and couldn't help but wonder why he was so worried about her. As Cyan was slowly moving away, Leximus approached Aaron. She placed both hands on her shoulders and, seeing that she was as red as a tomato, she became somewhat confused and asked if she was okay. Several minutes later, Cyan returned to the royal hall, where the dragon girl was peacefully sleeping in bed. He approached the bed, started looking around and wondering why there was no one here. He began calling for Brian and Karam. Upon hearing Cyan's voice, she began to manifest herself. Then, she closed her eyes, sighed, and asked him to wait a moment. She was a little annoyed because she couldn't even take a break around here. He turned his back to her, slightly turned his head towards her, and with a serious look asked her why she was in this form. Several seconds later, Karam fully manifested and appeared behind Cyan. She began to look at him with only one eye and explained that the reason was because it was more convenient for her when she needed to hide her presence. After saying this, she asked him why he had called her. Cyan started pointing to the side with his finger, looked at Karam, and gave her the order to go find Brian. Upon hearing this command, she began to look at him and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and wonder why she had to go look for Brian. She exploded with anger, started looking at him with a furious gaze, and asked him if she was a damn dog, and also why she should search for someone. She added that this wasn't how favors were requested. She was sure that Brian would find his way back just fine. Cyan began to look at her with a confused gaze and couldn't help but wonder why she was behaving this way. At that moment, Karam started to smell a strange scent. She revealed to Cyan that this smell was the scent of blood. Upon hearing this, Cyan began to look out the window with a surprised expression, became alert, and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. At the same time, in some alley of the city, someone delivered a strong blow to Brian, causing him to fall to the ground. This person was none other than Lewismil and his men. While he had one hand in his pocket, he began to approach Brian and with a smile, told him that they were doing this to him because he should have listened to them while they were still kind. He approached Brian and started staring at him intently, explaining with an arrogant smile that he had done annoying things to them. Brian, who was lying on the ground with a bruise on his face, started coughing up blood. At first, Lewismil thought he was the only guardian knight, but now seeing how weak he was, to him Brian was nothing more than garbage. Brian was so injured that he couldn't even stand up. Lewismil approached him and decided to cut him into pieces and send those pieces to his owner as a gift. He began to look at Brian with a disdainful gaze and an evil smile, revealing that they were doing this because his owner wanted to mistreat him right in front of him. Just the thought of it made Louismil feel nauseous. While Brian was lying on the floor, he started coughing. He decided to accept the consequences without thinking for a second, since he had sworn to give his life for Cyan. Upon hearing this, Louismil was somewhat surprised. He began to look at him with a confused expression and asked what he was talking about. Seeing Brian's attitude, his men started looking at him with disdain, clenched their teeth tightly, and couldn't help but feel furious. At that moment, Brian began to speak. Upon hearing his voice, Louismil became somewhat confused and started wondering why he was acting this way. Brian, who had a bruise on his cheek and eye, turned his head towards him, and as his eyes slowly closed, he began to smile and mockingly asked what he was going to do. For him, Louismil was a joke. He started staring at Brian, and upon realizing that he was a crazy bastard, he couldn't help but smile. With a smirk, he asked him if he had lost his mind because of the beating. For him, this was no longer fun. He put his hand in his pocket and with a smile, he gave the order to his men to kill him. Upon hearing his order, his men surrounded Brian, and with a smile, they began unsheathing their swords and prepared to finish him off. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.